Part 2. Internal Characteristics. Knowledge of the Psychological Terrain. The power of propaganda to incite action has often been challenged by the alleged fact that propaganda cannot really modify or create anything in man. We frequently find that psychological manipulations do not appreciably change an individual's firmly established opinion. A communist or a Christian with strong beliefs is very little, if at all, shaken by adverse propaganda. Similarly, a prejudice or a stereotype is hardly ever changed by propaganda. For example, it is almost impossible to break down racial prejudice by propaganda. What people think of Negroes, Jews, bourgeois, or colonialists will be only slightly altered by propaganda attempts. Similarly, a reflex or myth cannot be created out of nothing, as if the individual were neutral and empty ground on which anything could be built. Furthermore, even when the reflex has been created, it cannot be utilized to make an individual act in just any direction. The individual cannot be manipulated as if he were an object, an automaton. The automatic nature of created reflexes does not transform him into a robot. We can conclude from a large body of experience that the propagandist cannot go contrary to what is in an individual. He cannot create just any new psychological mechanism or obtain just any decision or action. But psychologists who make these observations draw a very hasty conclusion from them, that propaganda has very little effect, that it is so limited a field of action that it hardly seems useful. We shall show later why we consider this conclusion incorrect. But the observations themselves give us some very good indications as to what is effective propaganda. The propagandist must first of all know as precisely as possible the terrain on which he is operating. He must know the sentiments and opinions, the current tendencies, and the stereotypes among the public he is trying to reach. An obvious point of departure is the analysis of the characteristics of the group and its current myths, opinions, and sociological structure. One cannot make just any propaganda any place for anybody. Methods and arguments must be tailored to the type of man to be reached. Propaganda is definitely not an arsenal of ready-made, valid techniques and arguments suitable for use anywhere. Obvious errors in this direction have been made in the recent course of propaganda's history. The technique of propaganda consists in precisely calculating the desired action in terms of the individual who is to be made to act. The second conclusion seems to us embodied in the following rule: never make a direct attack on an established, reasoned, durable opinion or an accepted cliché, a fixed pattern. The propagandist wears himself out to no avail in such a contest. A propagandist who tries to change mass opinion on a precise and well-established point is a bad propagandist. But that does not mean that he must then leave things as they are and conclude that nothing can be done. He need only understand two subtle aspects of this problem. First of all, we recall that there is not necessarily any continuity between opinion or fixed patterns and action. There is neither consistency nor logic, and a man can perfectly well hold on to his property, his business, and his factory and still vote communist. Or he can be enthusiastic about social justice and peace, as described by the communists, and still vote for a conservative party. Attacking an established opinion or stereotype head-on would make the propagandee aware of basic inconsistencies and would produce unexpected results. The skillful propagandist would seek to obtain action without demanding consistency, without fighting prejudices and images, by taking his stance deliberately on inconsistencies. Second, the propagandist can alter opinions by diverting them from their accepted course, by changing them, or by placing them in an ambiguous context. Starting from apparently fixed and immovable positions, we can lead a man where he does not want to go, without his being aware of it, over paths that he will not notice. In this way, propaganda against German rearmament, organized by the partisans of peace and ultimately favorable to the Soviet Union, utilized the anti-German sentiment of the French right. Thus, existing opinion is not to be contradicted, but utilized. Each individual harbors a large number of stereotypes and established tendencies. From this arsenal, the propagandist must select those easiest to mobilize, those which will give the greatest strength to the action he wants to precipitate. Writers who insist that propaganda against established opinion is ineffective would be right if man were a simple being having only one opinion with fixed limits. This is rarely the case among those who have not yet been propagandized, although it is frequently the case among individuals who have been subjected to propaganda for a long time. But the ordinary man in our democracies has a wide range of feelings and ideas. Propaganda need only determine which opinions must not be attacked head-on and be content to undermine them gradually and to weaken them by cloaking them in ambiguity. The third important conclusion, drawn from experiments made chiefly in the United States, is that propaganda cannot create something out of nothing. It must attach itself to a feeling, an idea. It must build on a foundation already present in the individual. The conditioned reflex can be established only on an innate reflex or a prior conditioned reflex. The myth does not expand helter-skelter. It must respond to a group of spontaneous beliefs. Action cannot be obtained unless it responds to a group of already established tendencies or attitudes stemming from the schools, the environment, the regime, the churches, and so on. Propaganda is confined to utilizing existing material. It does not create it. This material falls into four categories. First, there are the psychological mechanisms that permit the propagandist to know more or less precisely that the individual will respond in a certain way to a certain stimulus. Here, the psychologists are far from agreement. Behaviorism, depth psychology, and the psychology of instincts postulate very different psychic mechanisms and see essentially different connections and motivations. Here, the propagandist is at the mercy of these interpretations. Second, opinions, conventional patterns, and stereotypes exist concretely in a particular milieu or individual. Third, ideologies exist which are more or less consciously shared, accepted, and disseminated, and which form the only intellectual, or rather para-intellectual, element that must be reckoned within propaganda. Fourth and finally, the propagandist must concern himself above all with the needs of those whom he wishes to reach. All propaganda must respond to a need, whether it be a concrete need, bread, peace, security, work, or a psychological need. We shall discuss this last point at length later on. Propaganda cannot be gratuitous. The propagandist cannot simply decide to make propaganda in such a direction on this or that group. The group must need something, and the propaganda must respond to that need. One weakness of tests made in the United States is that far too often the experimental propaganda used did not correspond to a single need of the persons tested. A frequent error on the part of propagandists pushing something is the failure to take into account whether or not the propagandee needs it. Of course, when we say that the propagandist has to use existing elements, we do not mean that he must use them in direct or unequivocal fashion. We have already indicated that he often must use them in indirect and equivocal fashion. When he does so, he can indeed create something new. The propagandist needs to base himself on what already exists does not prevent him from going further. If committed to a particular opinion, would he be obligated simply to repeat it indefinitely? Because he must pay lip service to a certain stereotype, is he limited to do nothing but reproduce that stereotype? Obviously not. What exists is only the raw material from which the propagandist can create something strictly new, which in all probability would not have sprung up spontaneously. Take, for example, unhappy workers threatened by unemployment, exploited, poorly paid, and without hope of improving their situation. Karl Marx had clearly demonstrated that they might have a certain spontaneous reaction of revolt, and that some sporadic outbursts might occur, but that this will not develop into anything else and will lead nowhere. With propaganda, however, this same situation and the existing sentiments might be used to create a class consciousness and a lasting and organized revolutionary trend. Similarly, if we take a population, not necessarily of the same race or language or history, but inhabiting the same territory, oppressed by the same conqueror, feeling a common resentment or hatred toward the occupying force, a sentiment generally found at a purely individual level, and in the grip of the enemy administration, only a few individual acts of violence will occur spontaneously, and more often, nothing at all. But propaganda can take it from there and arouse a nationalism, the foundations of which are perfectly natural, but which, as an integrated force, is entirely fabricated. This is true for Algerian, Yugoslavian, or African nationalism. In this way, propaganda can be creative, and it is in complete control of its creations. The passions or prejudices that it instills in a man serve to strengthen its hold on him, and thus make him do what he would never have done otherwise. It is not true that propaganda is powerless simply because, at the start, it is limited to what already exists. It can attack from the rear, wear down slowly, provide new centers of interest, which cause the neglect of previously acquired positions. It can divert a prejudice, or it can elicit an action contrary to an opinion held by the individual, without his being clearly aware of it. Finally, it is obvious that propaganda must not concern itself with what is best in man, the highest goals humanity sets for itself, its noblest and most precious feelings. Propaganda does not aim to elevate man, but to make him serve. It must therefore utilize the most common feelings, the most widespread ideas, the crudest patterns, and in so doing place itself on a very low level with regard to what it wants man to do and to what end. Hate, hunger, and pride make better levers of propaganda than do love or impartiality. Fundamental currents in society. Propaganda must not only attach itself to what already exists in the individual, but also express the fundamental currents of the society it seeks to influence. Propaganda must be familiar with collective sociological presuppositions, spontaneous myths, and broad ideologies. By this, we do not mean political currents or temporary opinions that will change in a few months, but the fundamental psychosociological basis on which a whole society rests. The presuppositions and myths, not just of individuals or of particular groups, but those shared by all individuals in a society, including men of opposite political inclinations and class loyalties. A propaganda pitting itself against this fundamental and accepted structure would have no chance of success. Rather, all effective propaganda is based on these fundamental currents and expresses them. Only if it rests on the proper collective beliefs will it be understood and accepted. It is part of a complex of civilization consisting of material elements, beliefs, ideas, and institutions, and it cannot be separated from them. No propaganda could succeed by going against these structural elements of society. But propaganda's main task clearly is the psychological reflection of these structures. It seems to us that this reflection is found in two essential forms: the collective sociological presuppositions and the social myths. By presuppositions, we mean a collection of feelings, beliefs, and images by which one unconsciously judges events and things without questioning them or even noticing them. This collection is shared by all who belong to the same society or group. It draws its strength from the fact that it rests on general, tacit agreement. Whatever the differences of opinion are among people, one can discover beneath the differences the same beliefs. In Americans and in Russians, in communists and in Christians. These presuppositions are sociological in that they are provided for us by the surrounding milieu and carry us along in the sociological current. They are what keeps us in harmony with our environment. It seems to us that there are four great collective sociological presuppositions in the modern world. By this we mean not only the Western world, but all the world that shares a modern technology and is structured into nations, including the communist world, though not yet the African or Asian worlds. These common presuppositions of bourgeoisie and proletariat are that man's aim in life is happiness, that man is naturally good, that history develops in endless progress, and that everything is matter. The other great psychological reflection of social reality is the myth. The myth expresses the deep inclinations of a society. Without it, the masses would not cling to a certain civilization or its process of development and crisis. It is a vigorous impulse, strongly colored, irrational, and charged with all of man's power to believe. It contains a religious element. In our society, the two great fundamental myths on which all other myths rest are science and history. And based on them are the collective myths that are man's principal orientations. The myth of work, the myth of happiness, which is not the same thing as the presupposition of happiness, the myth of the nation, the myth of youth, the myth of the hero. Propaganda is forced to build on these presuppositions and to express these myths, for without them, nobody would listen to it. And in so building, it must always go in the same direction as society. It can only reinforce society. A propaganda that stresses virtue over happiness and presents man's future as one dominated by austerity and contemplation would have no audience at all. A propaganda that questions progress or work would arouse disdain and reach nobody. It would immediately be branded as an ideology of the intellectuals, since most people feel that the serious things are material things because they are related to labor and so on. It is remarkable how the various presuppositions and aspects of myths complement each other, support each other, mutually defend each other. If the propagandist attacks the network at one point, all myths react to the attack. Propaganda must be based on current beliefs and symbols to reach man and win him over. On the other hand, propaganda must also follow the general direction of evolution, which includes the belief in progress. A normal, spontaneous evolution is more or less expected, even if man is completely unaware of it, and in order to succeed, propaganda must move in the direction of that evolution. The progress of technology is continuous. Propaganda must voice this reality, which is one of man's convictions. All propaganda must play on the fact that the nation will be industrialized, more will be produced, greater progress is imminent, and so on. No propaganda can succeed if it defends outdated production methods or obsolete social or administrative institutions. Though occasionally advertising may profitably evoke the good old days, political propaganda may not. Rather, it must evoke the future, the tomorrows that beckon, precisely because visions impel the individual to act. Propaganda is carried along on this current and cannot oppose it. It must confirm it and reinforce it. Thus, propaganda will turn a normal feeling of patriotism into a raging nationalism. It not only reflects myths and presuppositions, it hardens them, sharpens them, invests them with the power of shock and action. It is virtually impossible to reverse this trend. In a country in which administrative centralization does not yet exist, one can propagandize for centralization because modern man firmly believes in the strength of a centrally administered state. But where centralization does exist, no propaganda can be made against it. Federalist propaganda, true federalism, which is opposed to national centralism, not such supranationalism as the so-called Soviet or European federalism, can never succeed because it is a challenge to both the national myth and the myth of progress. Every reduction, whether to a work unit or an administrative unit, is seen as regression. Of course, when we analyze this necessary subordination of propaganda to presuppositions and myths, we do not mean that propaganda must express them clearly all the time. It need not speak constantly of progress and happiness, although these are always profitable themes. But in its general line and its infrastructure, it must allow for the same presuppositions and follow the same myths as those prevalent in its audience. There is some tacit agreement, for example. A speaker does not have to say that he believes man is good. This is clear from his behavior, language, and attitudes, and each man unconsciously feels that the others share the same presuppositions and myths. It is the same with propaganda. A person listens to a particular propaganda because it reflects his deepest unconscious convictions without expressing them directly. Similarly, because of the myth of progress, it is much easier to sell a man an electric razor than a straight-edged one. Finally, alongside the fundamental currents reflected in presuppositions and myths, we must consider two other elements. Obviously, the material character of a society and its evolution, its fundamental sociological currents, are linked to its very structure. Propaganda must operate in line with those material currents and at the level of material progress. It must be associated with all economic, administrative, political, and educational development. Otherwise, it is nothing. It must also reflect local and national idiosyncrasies. Thus, in France, the general trend towards socialization can be neither overridden nor questioned. The political left is respectable. The right has to justify itself before the ideology of the left, in which even rightists participate. All propaganda in France must contain and evoke the principal elements of the ideology of the left in order to be accepted. But a conflict is possible between a local milieu and the national society. The tendencies of the group may be contrary to those of the broader society. In that case, one cannot lay down general rules. Sometimes the tendencies of the local group win out because of the group's solidarity. Sometimes the general society wins out because it represents the mass and therefore unanimity. In any case, propaganda must always choose the trend that normally will triumph because it agrees with the great myths of the time, common to all men. The Negro problem in the American South is typical of this sort of conflict. The local Southerners' milieu is hostile to Negroes and favorable to discrimination, whereas American society as a whole is hostile to racism. It is almost certain, therefore, despite the deep-rooted prejudices and the local solidarities, that racism will be overcome. The Southerners are on the defensive. They have no springboard for external propaganda, for example, toward the European nations. Propaganda can only go in the direction of world opinion, that of Asia, Africa, almost all of Europe. Above all, when it is anti-racist, it is helped along by the myth of progress. It follows that propaganda cannot be applied everywhere alike, and that, at least up till now, propaganda in both Africa and Asia must be essentially different from propaganda in the rest of the world. We stress at least up to now because those countries are being progressively won over by Western myths and are developing national and technological forms of society. But for the moment, these myths are not yet everyday reality. Flesh and blood, spiritual bread, sacred inheritance as they are with us. To sum up, propaganda must express the fundamental currents of society.